Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Flourish FM. Nick and I have just interviewed Lisa Miller. Lisa Miller, PhD, is the New York Times bestselling author of The Spiritual Child and a professor in the clinical psychology program at Teachers College, Columbia University. She's the founder and director of the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute, which was the first Ivy League graduate program and research institute in spirituality and psychology. And she's held over a decade of joint appointments in the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia University Medical School. Her innovative research has been published in more than 100 peer-reviewed articles in leading journals. She's the editor of the Oxford University Press Handbook of Psychology and Spirituality. And she's authored two particularly influential books, The Spiritual Child and The Awakened Brain. And our conversation today focused in particular on the awakened brain, on the science of spirituality, on digging in deep into kind of the nuances of what the difference is between spirituality and religious belief, and what spirituality is, how it connects with the transcendent and transcendent experiences. We practiced live spiritual awareness psychotherapy on the call with her, which is the first time we've had any kind of live practice on a call. And we also looked at sort of how-to, how is it that we can cultivate spiritual awareness in our lives. Without further ado, this is our episode with Dr. Lisa Miller. Enjoy.
So peer review science, this isn't just, Dr. Miller's opinion, but peer review science shows through meticulously designed, nationally representative samples that a strong spiritual life, a young adult, a teen who says, my personal spirituality is highly important to me. That teen, a standard deviation above as compared to below the mean, is an 80% decreased relative risk of addiction using DSM diagnoses for drugs and alcohol, 82% less likely to take our lives when our spiritual life is shared, is shown through a meta-analysis, a summative paper of 2,000 plus tragically completed suicides, 5,000 plus matched controls. The meta-analysis showed 82% decreased relative risk of taking our life when spiritual life is shared among friends, shared in the fellowship, the sangha, the minyan, shared on the team, shared with the coach. This is who we are. We are ill because we have disintegrated the spiritual core from the hub of our being. We are ill because we are not integrated and whole. Disintegration is unhealth. And we have every ability, the second, right now, to re-enliven our natural spirituality. It is a quarter inch under the surface. This is our birthright. It's here. We just right now engaged it together through hosting council.
Well, thank you for that beautiful synopsis of so much research.
You were just talking about suicidality, which is something that is near and dear to my heart as well. And it's not only suicidality, right? So when you think about, anxiety disorders, when you think about depressive symptoms, mental illness, substance abuse, as far as I understand it, this is a lot of the grounding for why you believe so deeply in the power of the study of and training of spirituality, right? So can we pick those apart kind of in two parts? Will you tell our listeners, what do you mean by spirituality? And then we'll want to dig into that a little more deeply, separate it from religion. But just like on kind of a basic level, what do you mean by spirituality? And rehash for our listeners, why is it so important to mental health, thriving, flourishing, you name it?
Great. So, about 40 years ago, in a very positive attempt to be inclusive, certainly the United States and many other post-industrial global cultures threw all religious talk out of the public square. And it looked like taking a Christmas tree down from outside of town hall. It looked at the time as if it were an attempt to be inclusive and considerate. But actually what eventuated over 4 decades was that our society became radically exclusive of all talk of spirituality or religion from boardrooms, classrooms, anywhere that people meet. And we've ended up as a spiritually non-conversant society, which means, 40 years is long enough for someone to grow up, have a child who now is at the door of an entry-level job, higher education, the military. And for the first time, we have young adults who were raised in a society that did in no way embraced an understanding of spiritual life. So when we threw out religion, we threw the spiritual baby out with the bathwater. And what we now see clear as day from a statistical point of view is that with the epidemic of the diseases of despair, with the sharp increase in addiction, depression, and suicide, the rate of suicide rivals the rate of death by auto accident in high school. That's pushing into middle school. Columbia University had 9 publicly documented suicides in 1 year. I mean, this was just simply not the case 40 years ago. And it turns out that this sharp ascension in suffering goes hand in hand with a very sharp decrease in family faith observance, personal spiritual life. Religion and spirituality are not the same thing, but they go hand in hand for 70% of people. So 70% of people in the United States will say, I am spiritual and I am religious. For me, my spiritual life is held in the prayers, the meditation, the sacred text of my tradition, the ceremony, the community. 30% of millennials and more with each younger generation say I am spiritual, but I am not religious. For me, spiritual life is felt in nature with my family when I hear music.
That's me, by the way. That really spoke to me, that phrasing. Yeah, I say exactly that word for word frequently. So that part spoke to me a lot.
And where is spiritual for you? Music, nature?
A lot of nature, a lot of this sort of work, like helping others, but nature for sure. I think I used to connect to sport that way a little bit more. My minor in undergrad was the academic studies of religion. I actually used to have a certification to teach it. So like in an academic way, I'm very interested in it. I'm just not a practitioner of organized religion.
Well, it's very interesting you should mention service and altruism, helping others, because when we looked at all of the different dimensions that can be identified through the lens of science, of lived human spirituality, the one that actually has the most immediate transformative effect of things we can choose to do is actually service, altruism, love of neighbor.
Wow.
And it's very, very interesting. Love of neighbor actually uses the same neuro docking station that we use when we're in relationship to God or our higher power. So relational spirituality, the same neuro seat through which I talk to who I call God, someone could say higher power or Jesus or the universe force, is the very same seat through which I feel God's presence in my love for a brother or a sister, fellow human beings.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So let's tease this part a little bit more. And obviously, John, jump in here if you want. But you touched on spirituality, right? And religion. I won't say versus, but like they seem to kind of like coexist or co-vary, if you will, right? For 70% of the population. There's that smaller percentage like myself who might say spiritual, not religious. And then there's probably a percentage of population that says neither, I assume.
Yeah.
Teeny, what's the percentage? Do you know off the top?
Well, it's usually less than 5% that say I'm no.
Okay.
But I think you're onto a good point. What do we mean by spiritual? If most everyone is a spiritual, well, frankly, the science says we are all spiritual beings, and there's some people who do not feel it or identify it, but they do have the genes if they choose to cultivate it. So I would say every one of us is endowed with the capacity for spiritual life. And what do you mean by that? Well, it's a big claim, right? So exactly what is meant. And scientists, of course, don't define spirituality all told like a theologian, but we're quite good at identifying threads of lived human spiritual life that are game-changing on the rest of our lives. We're good at identifying threads of lived human spiritual life, which we can say have an innate footing, that we are born with the genes or the neurodocking station. And the two threads of lived human spiritual life that are both innate and game-changing on the rest of our lives are a direct transcendent relationship. Some people may say, I turn to God and I feel an answer in my heart. Other people might say, I feel one with all creation. And some people might say, I feel spirit or God or Wananichi in and through earth and crow and sun. And whether we experience that transcendent relationship in a dialogue, through a oneness, or in the third person, that's just sort of the downstream cognitive wrap on the deeper seat of perception, which is we're endowed with capacity for a transcendent relationship, which is more than a belief. It is a felt, known experience of a relationship. And the second dimension is that we can feel the presence of the transcendent relationship in our love for one another, love of neighbor. So love of the higher power, love of neighbor. These are capacities. Why is that significant? And why do we know that's innate? Well, we can tell any trait at all, whether it's temperament, IQ, risk for schizophrenia, any human trait can be identified as It's some of being relatively innate versus relatively environmentally formed through the use of a twin study. A twin study shows us, for instance, that our temperament is half innate, half environmentally formed. So if you've ever seen a baby, if you've ever seen two babies, we come with some innate temperament. You can compare two babies, half and half environmental, half innate. IQ, you're both very smart, got your graduate degrees. Well, that's 60% innate. You were born smart, and 40% cultivated. When we're young, by the environment hoisted on us. And as we get older, we choose our environment. So we're in control of our evolution to some extent. Spirituality is 1/3 innate, 2/3 environmentally formed, and more specifically, the felt sense of a transcendent relationship and the cultivation of love of neighbor in that awareness. 1/3 innate, 2/3 environmentally formed, which means it is our birthright. But I'm not surprised there's a few percent of people who say I'm not spiritual because the 2/3 was not wrapped around their natural core and cultivated.
So I was just going to ask, for that 2/3, is there a limitation to capacity, or is it just that there's not sort of a natural propensity, right? They're not playing with a stacked deck, so to speak. Does that limit them, or it just means they might have to work a little harder?
Well, so to be more clear, so what the twin study tells us is the tendency to feel a spiritual connection comes to each and every one of us through 1/3 our genes, 2/3 how that natural spiritual culture. Yeah, and that 2/3 wrap, that 2/3 embrace of the spiritual core can include religion, right? And when the religion is harmonious with natural spirituality, it can be very cultivating of the spiritual core. And when the human messengers, the torchbearers of a faith tradition, don't walk the walk in those specific cases, it can actually be a source of spiritual injury for young people. So the nature of the 2/3 embrace is very important in our development.
Okay, so thank you very much for this. So I really want us to get as clear as possible on these terms and related terms. And I know for some of these, this might be difficult because within religious and spiritual concepts, often there's debate as to what degree they might be ineffable, beyond language and so on. But let's see how clear we can make them for our listeners, right? So you mentioned transcendence a few times, and that spiritual experiences are experiences of the transcendent. Tell me if I get any of this wrong, please. Is a transcendent experience one that is of something that you believe to be beyond the material world, or is it something kind of extraordinary, not like a normal experience, that feels very different or completely different to your normal everyday experiences?
So transcendence in this line of science is the capacity to perceive a consciousness field, a spirit, some animating force in and through and among us, the material world, so that the ultimate bottom line of what is real is not matter alone. It is not the material world alone, but rather there's a felt perceived awareness of a force, whether we call it spirit or consciousness, that is in and through. It is intelligent, it is guiding, it is loving, it is a force in and through all life. The perception of that presence and evermore to be in relationship with that presence is a transcendent relationship. Now, the other idea that you point out is also very compelling, which is a mystical experience, an experience that is profound and breaks from the ordinary pattern that we perceive in the laws of nature. And I would say that actually there are two types of miracles. There's the ones that happen every single day expressed through the laws of nature. And then there's the miracles that break from the laws of nature. I don't think, most of the field says breaking from the laws of nature makes it a miracle. I disagree with that definition, but it's a perfectly good one and people use it. So experiences that break from the rules of natural law are always viewed, almost always, as miracles. But we've talked to hundreds and hundreds of adolescents, and almost every single adolescent has had a profound mystical experience. Almost every adolescent says, I was walking through the parking lot. I was on my way to school, and there was this huge crack in the pavement. I looked at it, and I saw a single blade of grass. And suddenly I knew, I was completely aware that the whole universe is in that blade of grass. And then I went on and I went to school, but it always stayed with me. And I'm really glad you asked, because actually no one's ever asked before.
So can we double click on that for a second? I'm very interested in this. And I thought of it kind of reading the opening chapters of your book. We had on a guest that talked about school well-being. Okay. So as I said, traditionally, John and I both come from schools as well. We do a lot of different things, but we spend a lot of time in classrooms. We're talking to this individual, an expert in their field, and they're talking about a particular model for well-being. And we sort of said, it seems like it's missing meaning, right? And the response we got back was that in their study, which was a peer-reviewed, published, reputable study, it just didn't really come up as important to young people, right? I don't expect you to know, but I'm curious to hear your hypothesis as to why that might be, because I think what I'm picking up from you here in this conversation in the book is that that's not natural. That's actually kind of the result of maybe some misdesign in the way we've been kind of behaving and molding things over the previous few decades. Do I have that right?
I completely agree with what you said, that there's a felt sense that we don't talk about that here, or the experience might even tragically be discounted and not honored by the child or the teen, because there's no language and talk around spiritual and mystical experience. And hundreds of teens said, wow, no one has ever asked, but I know there's something going on. There was a lovely study done with younger children where a parent was asked to keep a journal of every discussion with the child around spiritual life. And in the first week, sort of conscious that they were in a study, parents started initiating questions. What do you think is the meaning of life? Where do you think God is? Why do you think there's good? And by the second week, the child initiated most of the questions, which I interpret to mean that the child suddenly realized, oh, we talk about that here. It's real. If the parent says it's real, it's real. I think what we've done is tragically through omission, through silencing the public square on spiritual life, we've sent the message to teens and young adults that somehow it's secondary, if not tertiary, it doesn't really matter. Some don't even know it exists. There's no language, there's no clarity. There's no statement that the most important, the spiritual core is the hub of the person. How many young people have heard that? Yeah. But it's true. Yeah, it's true. It's scientifically the case.
So you discuss in your book, The Awakened Brain, amazing book, by the way, blew my mind. I really enjoyed reading it over the past week. I've struggled to put it down, actually.
He texts me separately about it, Lisa. Like, he doesn't do that for every book. He texts me, he's like, this, I'm just absolutely enthralled. So he's not just blowing smoke at you here.
I mean, I really, really enjoyed reading this, and I really have, it's a real page turner. So thank you for this wonderful book. In there, you talk about transcendent experiences being those that you can have in a variety of forms. So you could have it during a sporting event, playing music, in nature. But does it have to be, in those cases, an experience of something beyond the material world? Because what I'm imagining is you're in nature and you just feel amazing, and you notice the kind of the restorative experience of being in nature, and you're like, wow, this is amazing. I'm so grateful for the world that exists and this experience right now. But maybe you don't go any further and identify it with anything beyond the physical world. But is it not then a transcendent experience? I'm just trying to dig in, where the limits of transcendent experiences lie. And let's just go with that for now.
Beautiful. So thank you. And I love the hair splitting nature of fabulous. Okay. Right. So I would say that what you described is a self-transcendent experience beyond limitations and spinning of the ego. And the very same word that happens to sound and look alike can also be applied, transcendence, to a felt connection of the spirit or force in and through all life. So whereas one is a self-transcendent experience, the other is a connection to the transcendent, who I would call God, some might call the force of life, or Jesus, Hashem, Allah. But whatever we call this great force, we experience it the same way when we look at how the brain works. Whether I'm someone who is Muslim or Hindu or Jewish or spiritual but not religious, the same neurocorrelates run when we feel a deep connection to the force in and through life, when we feel that we are in relationship to who I call God, the higher power. I think what has happened right now in our society is that after 40 years of not talking about that, we've bottomed out. Just the individual bottoms out in his or her journey. I've lost my job. I'm too late at the party drunk. My spouse is sick of me. Like, my life is falling apart. Okay, now I'm allowed to talk in our society about handing it over. Now it's okay, right? But what about not waiting till I fall apart? What about handing it over when I'm 2 or 12 or 25 and developing this natural human capacity to be loved and held and guided through a transcendent relationship?
Upstream.
Upstream. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
And does your research suggest that self-transcendent experiences are as good for our well-being as transcendent experiences?
Well, very often when people describe a self-transcendent experience, it is powerful, it is meaningful. There's often then a sense of, and I felt one with all nature. It often moves into a sense, I felt part of the family of life, unitive awareness, which is a form of, unitive awareness is a form of is a piece of a transcendent experience.
Right. So, and you have that with other people. I take it at a sporting match, or if you're playing music, or playing in a sporting match, or with loving relatives or friends, with your romantic partner and so on. That feeling of oneness with others, that's self-transcendent, but that feeling of oneness is what, as it were, a fully transcendent experience with something beyond the material world is the next step.
Yes,
beyond that.
I feel I'm at one with all of life. And what's beautiful, this is my favorite finding in all of science, is that beautiful experience that you described, John, of feeling one with all of life, the sun and the light on the glacier and the moving water and the birds. In that moment, the brain gives off high amplitude alpha, a wavelength high amplitude alpha, which is the very same wavelength that we call in another field Schumann's resonance, the vibration of all life, from the Earth's crust up 1 mile all the way around the Earth, which means the spiritually engaged brain in a unit of experience is truly at the level of the wavelength consciousness, part of the oneness of all life. We return to nature. We return to our nature. I would say we return to the source of all life that's in and through us. Because I've noticed, animals know what's going on. Animals have, everybody sees this, an internal GPS. Animals know we're coming home before you can hear the car. I mean, my husband will be on the phone with me, and I'm there next to my dog, and my husband's in another city or another country, and he says, you know what, I'm going to be heading home now. There's like a shift in his energy, and my dog runs to the door. So the dog doesn't hear the car pull in. I mean, he's calling me from Chicago. The dog feels the shift. I'm coming home now. The dog is non-local, right? And we are non-local when we use it.
Okay, so this is the cue to bring in another complex term, and we're gonna have to focus quite a lot on, as you put it, splitting hairs here, because we were only really get some precision on these very difficult metaphors. Because just to make this as clear as possible, synchronicity, right? You speak about this in The Awakened Brain, and it's a wonderful story to about this in the context of the psychology of Jung as well. It seems like the dog story is perhaps an example of synchronicity, where, so tell me if I've got this right, the idea is you perceive in the world, or in your experience of the world, a connection between what seem to be otherwise unrelated events, but in order to see that synchronicity, you have to have the right kind of attitude toward, an openness towards seeing these things in the world. You tell this beautiful story in your book of the duck appearing at your door with a duck embryo, and how that had a huge personal resonance with you. So could you describe what synchronicity is and the role of that in spirituality?
Right. So I think almost everyone can locate a time in our lives where two events that were physically unrelated. I was thinking of my friend. I hadn't talked to her for 10 years. I came home and the phone machine was blinking. Right? Or, I was wondering, and I share this in The Awakened Brain, I'm never going to be a mother. My husband and I grappled with infertility for years. I was so depressed. And, I sit down on the bus is completely empty. And a gentleman gets on, and I think, no way. And he's walking straight down the bus towards me. completely depressed. And I think, please, sir, sit anywhere but by me. And in an empty bus, the gentleman sits right next to me. He was a quite unique fellow. And he looked at me and he said, miss, you look like just that type of woman that would go all around the world adopting all sorts of kids. So he'd come to tell me that, that's far too unprobabilistic to have happened by chance. I mean, I wouldn't be much of a scientist, if I cast that aside. I sat on the bus for 5 years before. I've sat on the bus for 15 years after. On no other day, so take 20 times 365 times 2 trips a day, on no other day has someone sat down next to me and said that. So that is far too unprobabilistic to have happened by chance. And when we can use a broader range of human knowing, when we can engage, of course, the empiricism of our lives, like I just said, it was far too probabilistic to have happened by chance. And the logic with which we're endowed is important, but also our intuition and the possibility of the type of mystical experience that breaks the laws of nature, the regular patterns. When we use all of our forms of knowing, we can actually look at life in a very fresh, perceptive way, all of us, not just, the greatest monks or all of us, and say, wow, what is life showing me now? I call that an awakened perception. A synchronicity is when we perceive that there's a deeper meaning underneath 2 events that are mechanistically unrelated. So, Carl Jung talked about this. I have a student right now who is noticing in his study of Carl Jung that he actually knew Einstein. And the idea of the atom and the archetype grew up together. So that's fabulous.
Interesting.
Wow.
So, I think that our society has not given us room to look at non-mechanistic relationships in the flow of life. Again, that sort of gets cast out. But that is actually bad science. When we throw away the preponderance of the evidence, that's bad science. When we say, that's an outlier, therefore it doesn't count.
Well, so that's what I was going to ask you about, is because my immediate question was like, okay, that makes sense. And how do you reconcile that with being a serious scientist yourself and saying like, okay, it's far too unprobabilistic. But I guess my simple question is like, do we have statistical methods to prove otherwise? Or is this where we get to that point where you're moving past like what you described as ways of knowing, right? And you have to kind of go beyond these frameworks that we use and these mental models to understand the world. Are we moving past that point, or can you reconcile them within our current ways of knowing?
So that is a fabulous question. And the way I think about that is that our deep inner wisdom, our intuition is hard data. Our mystical awareness is hard data. So I don't feel that there's a need to prove through any specific form of knowing that which is perceived through an adjacent form of knowing. They're all valid. And still it is the case that if we did a grand study of synchronicities, I bet we could show it empirically, because at the end of the day, it's been my experience that any lens ultimately can be used to look at anything.
It'd be fascinating, because I think you're exactly right. Everyone can probably describe those moments, right? And I'm glad to have a word to label it with now. Makes me super curious whether or not that is truly an outlier and coincidence, or if we can somehow test and identify, as you described it, some sort of force or design, whatever it might be. It's a fascinating question.
Well, and you're converging on an important point. So an outlier, that's a description of a data point, right? But when I was taught about outliers, I was taught that because they were a departure from the normative curve, they therefore were invalid, right? Or random. But there was absolutely no evidence that it was invalid or random. It was simply a departure from the preponderance of the curve.
Right.
And I think that there's a lot of assumptions in how we're raised as scientists that silently posit a random, meaningless universe. For instance, the idea that randomness. I've yet to see a single study prove a concept of randomness versus a life or world that has a design to it. I mean, if you throw up a bunch of chips, they don't land evenly dispersed. They land in clusters. Interesting.
Have you read or consumed any of Todd Rose's stuff, like The End of Average?
Oh, tell me more.
It's just so on key with what you're talking about. I think you'd really dig it. You happen, because we want to pull this back to transcendence and flow. We have a bunch of connections, but you both happen to be on the psychology podcast within a few months of each other. And so I'm just curious if you know one another. But essentially, the argument in the end of average is like our entire statistical system, evaluation system, education system is based on this idea of a mean or an average. And when you look at a lot of these different studies, there's really no such thing. So like the common example is LeBron James averages X amount of points, rebounds, and assists, right, for his entire career. But he's actually had a game where he got those points, rebounds, and assists like once or twice, right? You can look at a bunch of different brains together and mash them together and say, okay, that's the quote unquote average brain, but you can't find a human brain that looks like that, right?
And I would chalk up into that same realm of inference, the idea, the assumption that the universe is random. That is an assumption, right? I mean, I was taught in psychology that the meaning in dreams is post hoc ascribed to the random firing of neurons. But that makes no sense to me because, first of all, in dreams, we often have a hunch that something's coming, like, oh no, oh no, oh no, it's a nightmare, and then it comes. So that was not a post hoc interpretation. That was an anticipation of something happening in a dream. The other thing is that, if you look at synchronicities, if you look at dreams, the proof is in the pudding. I mean, when we look at life as carrying meaning, that meaning's written into the fabric of life, and it's revealed oftentimes symbolically through a synchronicity, through a dream, through who you meet and when you meet them. Why of all days do I get to meet you two gentlemen today, not 2 years ago, not 2 years from now, and have this discussion now? And maybe there's someone who's joining us who's on their path grappling with synchronicity, not 2 years ago and not 2 years from now, but now. So, I was really, by good, loving, smart people, taught an assumption that was in the air and water of science, that it's a meaningless universe. But my experience has been that there is indeed meaning written into the universe. And science on the nature of our brain shows there is a circuit through which we perceive that we are actually guided. There is a human capacity through which we perceive guidance, that we're not going to drop through the abyss to existential nowhere, but that we're held. That life isn't actually bitter or random. There's actually love woven into the fabric of reality. This is a seat of human perception. And certainly you can make the argument that, well, humans see things that way because it's nice to see things that way and we survive, the sort of old post hoc social biological argument. But the proof is in the pudding, and when synchronicities bear fruit, then actually it looks like we're wired to see something very real. And most important things in my life have not come through planning. They've come through following the thread.
So this is great. I've got a bunch of how-to questions. I imagine John does too, right? But we can segment that. The thought in my head is, okay, there's this circuit that basically creates this perception that we're being guided by something, right? That there's these hands, whatever it might be, and that you have referenced a couple times that typically is received as sort of like loving, right? In some way, shape, or form. And okay, right. And so as a student of history, where does my head go right away? Well, there's a whole lot of bad stuff that's been done in the name of the guidance of religion and the guidance of spirituality. I guess my question is what's the dark side of this? Can this go wrong? Why does it have to have that loving feature? Is it a double-edged sword? Does the core of that question make sense?
So what I would say through the lens of science is that there's a seat of human perception, which I do not think constructs. I mean, the 20th century view of the brain is that it makes stuff up. I think we can construct, but we can also detect. So from your generation younger, you're used to pulling information out of the air. It didn't come through telephone lines. And
literally,
a direct pickup in the universe is something pretty comfortable to people your age and younger. Okay. So my view of the brain is that it does not merely construct, it also detects. And maybe it's even a reification, a coming into matter of consciousness. Because when you meditate a lot, you have synaptogenesis. And maybe that's because it's nourishing, but maybe that's because your consciousness is reifying. So whatever the case, the brain is not merely constructive, it detects. And that said, what we have identified through science, through MRI studies, is a seat of perception, I would say, of uptake, right? Of action, in the same way that I see a chair and a table and then I don't walk into it. We are designed to be able to perceive the reality of a loving, guiding presence in and through life. And that is one of the dimensions of lived spirituality with which we're endowed that opens up into a much better life. Religion can foster that. Other things can foster that. But when anything, a philosophy, a political philosophy, a religion, theology obstructs loving, guiding, holding, it is not spiritual in the sense that it is not part of our human design to be in.
By definition.
That's interesting. So do I think that wars in the so-called name of religion are spiritual? No. Do I think that throwing people out of a house of worship because they're different is spiritual? No. Loving, guiding, holding is spiritual. And there can be religions that certainly cultivate that, where we show up in our loving and guiding for each other. But anything that doesn't do loving, guiding isn't spiritual. And whether it calls itself a political philosophy, a dictatorship, or anything else, it's not spiritual.
That seems to, John, you recall, that seems to jive really well when we had our conversation, with Emily Esfahani-Smith, author of The Power of Meaning. That seemed to be a common thread as well. Like, we got into a conversation we don't need to have, which is X terrible historical figure. Were they living a meaningful life? And I think her response was basically no, because you're missing that sense of like love. You're missing that sense of altruism. You're missing that sense of positive impact. I think spirituality and meaning are tightly connected. And here you are saying something quite similar, it sounds like.
Yes, exactly. And, there's this tendency in our culture because no one will talk about God or spirit or transcendence or miracles in the public square, to say things like, well, what is spirituality? It's handing it to something bigger than yourself. There's some beautiful, loving, guiding things that are bigger than myself. And then there's things bigger than myself that are not loving, that are not guiding, and are not beautiful.
Yeah.
And one of them is terrorism, right? Young people looking for something loving, guiding, and beautiful can meet bad actors. And we're particularly susceptible to that when we're in a phase of rapid spiritual quest and seeking. So from 15 to 18 to 20 to 24, we are hardwired to be on a quest, a deeply spiritual quest. And when a good actor comes along, they meet one of you two and then they go on a journey of meaning. That's wonderful. That's the 2/3 environmental embrace, realizing the natural spiritual possibility of that young adult. But a bad actor can play tricks. And there's no question that, self-destructive behavior, young people getting into cults, young people absorbed into terrorism, movements that are nihilistic, people don't join them when they're 45. We join them when we're 22 by and large. And that's because we actually are in a phase of seeking something good.
Okay, so spirituality by definition is love guiding, guided by love, not love guide, or both love guiding and guided by love?
Both. Yes. Beautiful. Loving, guiding, holding, and never alone is the neurocircuitry through which we perceive the thread of lived spirituality that changes our lives.
Okay, thank you. And spirituality involves an experience of the transcendent, but that can be an experience of something that you perceive to be beyond the material world, or an experience of self-transcendence, that is something beyond yourself. For example, a collective sense of oneness with other people.
15% of people say my relationship to ultimate reality is felt in relationship to other people. But it's the three of us and then cathected by actually really a transcendent humanism.
And would a person be spiritual if that was kind of the end point? If their experience of spirituality, or at least relatively spiritual to a degree, perhaps, if their experience of spirituality is a connection with others through music, through sports, through nature, is that I'm sorry if I'm hair splitting too much, I'm trying to get really precise with this. Is that enough for spirituality, even to a small degree?
That is certainly enough for someone's life. That is certainly enough to be a self-transcendent experience. But the dialogue with spirit, the sense that we are actually in a relationship with a loving, guiding, intelligent force in the universe is more than the sort of supersized humanism. It's a deep relationship with an intelligent, loving universe.
Okay.
Can we?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I have to ask one other question, which is...
No, I mean, you're drilling down on it. That's exactly.
It's about the randomness claim. So I could see how someone would, of course, one can argue that the universe is not random. You could argue for determinism, right? But what I don't yet see is why that's enough to get us to the transcendent, as in there must therefore be something beyond the material universe, because you could be a determinist without believing there's anything immaterial or anything metaphysical.
Can you tell John's a philosopher, by the way?
Can we do a practice? Can we do a practice and then pick up our discussion? Can we do that?
A practice? Oh, one of your spiritual oh yeah, of course. So we should tell listeners that you've developed a whole spiritual form of psychotherapy, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is this what you want to do now on our call?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's funny you bring it up because I wanted to hot seat John, because everything you're talking about here, Lisa, like the history, John's a former professional musician, right? And we both coach flow. I would love to ask you about the state of flow. You're bringing up mystical, you're bringing up transcendent, you've brought up music a couple of times, and I'd be curious to concretize this through John's experience of it. John, no pressure, and we can always edit it out, but it just seems like a great way to like bring some of these ideas home a bit.
When you're in a state as musicians, you're both musicians?
Just John.
Just John. Okay, John said, but you both work in a state of flow, which is closely allied. When I actually started the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute at Columbia 20 years ago, there'd never been a class on spirituality. And we taught the first one. I taught the first one. And 2/3 of the people in the class were musicians. It was before wellness coaching. It was before spirituality was talked about in psychology. And all these musicians came. And one fellow, I remember him so well. He said, for me, words don't do a very good job at holding my spiritual experience. Music can hold it.
Oh, that resonated with John. I can see it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Music for me has always been my highest flow experience. I've struggled to find anything that comes close. To the point where I have to keep music at a distance now in my life, because it's like getting back into a relationship can't work. If I pick up a guitar too often, I'll make some decision like, right, I'm going to devote my life to that and just quit everything else right now. You get a text from me to Nick, sorry man, I got to leave the podcast. I'm getting back into music again. And I've had this a few times in my life, this extreme, so it's because the passion is there so strong.
John, what does that feel like? Where do you go?
I would agree with you. Absolutely right. It's hard to express it in words. It's a deeply creative space where you lose yourself completely in what you're doing. And it's most profound when you are either playing with other musicians and you lock into the same space together, which you could call group flow, right? When you know everyone's feeling that same thing at the same time, and you're doing some brilliant improvisation together live, and you just feel it, this connection with each other, that you're all on the same page. Or if you're in a very creative space yourself and you write something you're very happy with, and the way it captures an emotion for you. So if I ever have really difficult emotional experiences like grief, the first thing I think to do is turn to a guitar and write something, because it's the best way for me to deal with difficult emotional experiences.
Beautiful. So that sense of being swept in, and when as a group you play, I mean, does it feel as if you have, from out here, it feels like you've instantiated some sort of unitive field, so invoked or hosted?
Oh, absolutely.
And the thing called the muse for the creative artist is actually, I mean, I wonder if that's this force coming through you all.
Yeah, I mean, this is where my questions come in. So I don't want to come across as deeply skeptical. I love your book, I love your work, and I really don't want to be the skeptic in the room. But the struggle I have is the step from there to the metaphysical, the transcendent beyond the material world. Because for me, it's group flow. It's a shared. We're sharing in the same mental state. Because we're all identifying that we're playing in the same, let's say, key, expressing the same emotion. We're feeling off the energy of the crowd. All of these variables come together at once to give this beautiful group experience, like you might also get among a sports team or among a crowd at a sports match. I want to say that that's maybe transcendent in a non-immaterial sense. I want to make the further move, but that's why I keep asking these questions that are splitting hairs.
Right. Here's a beautiful study that draws a distinction between door number 1. We are 5 musicians, each in our own individual heads, having reached the same stance, and we feel together. Versus door number 2, we're 5 musicians reaching the same stance, through which in and through and around us is a consciousness field, simultaneously informing our 5 brains. Okay? What's the difference between door number 1 and door number 2? There's a science experiment that can address it. Shall I?
Yeah. There's, okay. But even on that though, that's where, and I might be coming across as too materialist here, but still, for me, we can have that as material, as a non-transcendent experience, like, because we could perhaps in the future measure that consciousness, right?
Oh yes. Okay, let me give an experiment and see if this.
Yeah. Lay it on us. Yeah.
Okay. So this is beautiful. I share this in the Awakened Brain. There was a scientist named Achterhoff, and what she did was invite a traditional healer, a traditional Hawaiian healer in this case, into an MRI machine. And then down the hall, actually across the street, as the experiment deepened in another building, was a second MRI machine in which was located the patient. So the healer is in building number 1, the patient is in building number 2. They both go into the MRI, moves into the tunnel, and the healer starts to do his or her work. And time again, a predictable pattern comes up on the MRI, tracking blood flow, same healing pattern. Within an instant, the identical pattern is shown in the patient, separated in an entirely different building. So one thing, healing consciousness in 2 places at least, right? And it gets to the notion that the healer may have invoked a state of consciousness, and then that was moving, the consciousness was detected and moving the brain detecting consciousness of the patient. Right. So that type of study suggests that 5 musicians in sync are, yes, connected as 5, distinct atomistic people playing together. And it may also be the case that there's a consciousness field that is simultaneously present in all 5 of your brains.
I see.
Which is beautiful. And can I share what the musician in my class said? This is a gift to you.
Please.
Okay. It's so much fun in life to get to be a messenger. Someone tells you something profound. 10 years.
It sounds like synchronicity to me.
Right. Yes. Right. Synchronicity isn't on just the moment by moment. It can be over time. So here we go. A musician, at the end of my class, I say, I want you to present a spiritual moment in your life, one that you want to share. And it can be expressed in any form. It can be in the form of music. It can be in the form of art. It can be a story from your life. But I want you to share something from your own journey, your spiritual path, with your fellow classmates. The musician stands up and he says, I want to play for you my band performing the same song 3 times. He plays it. And the first time it's all sort of cacophonous and they haven't hit a groove. And the second time it's better. And then the third time they're in sync, collective, as both of you are. Okay. And he said, what do you think happened here? And the student raises her hand, and of course she's right. She said, were you in a fight? So in the first performance, the band was at odds with each other. They were angry. And because there was not the hosting of the common consciousness field, the piece wasn't held at the unitive field. By the third time it was. Now, that can be brought to other areas of our society. I mean, it certainly can be brought to how a couple gets along. It can be brought to how buddies get along. It can be brought to, Phil Jackson had the Bulls meditate and they could pass the ball without knowing where each other are. We can work together when we know ourselves as together invoking a common consciousness field that is loving and guiding.
All right. So all that's incredible. There's our segue. Tell us how.
People often say, has synchronicity happened in my life? I have to think about that. It's kind of a mind-blowing concept. And so I invite them to do a thought practice. Do you want to try and explore this?
Sure.
Yeah, I love these. Let's just give it a go. This is great.
Yeah.
Okay, terrific. So I'm going to invite you to close your eyes, clear out your inner space, 5 breaths, and open up your inner chamber.
Our listeners are going to listen to us breathe right now? Is that what's happening?
Mm-hmm. I invite you to think of a time where you really wanted something. You were going for it and you wanted it badly and you prepared. You researched it. You got the right strategy. You put the time in. You got A plus B plus C leading you to that red door. I mean, that could be a promotion. It could have been admission to a school. It could have been getting her or him to say yes. Something you really wanted. And it was on its way, 99%. And then as you reached for that red door, it was yours. You grabbed the handle, but it was stuck. And I mean, you couldn't believe it was stuck because you'd done everything right and fair. And at first it might have not even been comprehensible, maybe annoying or infuriating. And then it gave way to depression, but only because that red door was stuck. You took a turn. You took a hairpin turn. You turned 40 degrees. You turned 140 degrees. A hairpin turn. And over there was a wide open, gloriously shimmering yellow door. You might have said, I'd never thought of yellow doors, or yellow doors, do they exist? But there it was. It was wide open. And on the other side of that yellow door was someone even more right for you, was a job that made you feel alive in a way you didn't think work could be, was a different graduate program with a different mentor who opened up your world. It was so right for you, that yellow door, that it has everything to do with your life today. And as you think of that shut red door, that hairpin turn leading to the wide open yellow door, was there anyone who pointed the way, supported you, gave you a story from their own life or a bit of information that set you in that direction? It could have been someone you met for 2 minutes at the coffee shop. It could have been a dear friend or a grandparent telling you a story for the first time. But that person was a guide. They were a trail angel. And as you step back now and you look at the stuck red door, the hairpin turn, the trail angel, and the wide open yellow door that has everything to do with your life today, how are some of the biggest, most important parts of our lives really, how does life unfold? You didn't get what you wanted. You got something better than you wanted. And as you sit way back, stuck red door, hairpin turn, trail angel, wide open yellow door, where in this picture, in your road of life, is your higher power? Is the higher power in the open yellow door, the trail angel, the stuck red door too? And if you didn't get what you want, but you got something better than what you wanted, are there times in our lives that are not about what do I want and how am I going to get it, pure achieving, but are there times in our lives where we can change our conversation with life and say, what is life showing me now? Less narrowly makers of our path and more discoverers of our journey. And if you've been in dialogue with life all along, perhaps are you already on a spiritual path? And when you're ready, I invite you back.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Wow.
So we keep talking about guidance, right? And this idea that, like these things aren't just happening coincidentally, right? I always, and I might always, maybe it's a fixed mindset, have trouble reconciling that with like candidly when just shitty stuff happens to good people. I think a lot of people struggle with that, and that would maybe pull us back to religion. We don't need to go back that route, but I think a lot of people struggle with that. How might you tease that apart, given some of the things we've talked about here today?
So I think there's alignment with force and misalignment with force. And when we show up and are loving and guiding, when we're the trail angels for one another, when we say, what is life showing me now? When we take that turn, we are in dialogue with life. We're aligned. But I can identify even in my own life when I'm misaligned with life. So I'll tell you something that's a pain in my heart to this day. I'm driving along. I'm in a really grumpy mood. I feel I'm misaligned. I feel that I haven't done for me is prayer, meditation, aligning. Every morning I go into nature. I didn't do it enough. I wasn't ready for the day. And the speed limit's 40 and I'm going 55. And I can feel that strained discordance with the deeper rhythm of life. And suddenly a bird swoops down in front of my car and I hit and I kill this beautiful bird. If I'd been going 40, the bird would have lived. Right? So I knew that I was off with the rhythm. And I think that what is evil and what is wrong is when we're not walking with the rhythm of the force of life. And sure, the stuff that you call shitty stuff happening to good people, that is not done in accordance with the rhythm of life. So love-guided held is something we feel when we are attuned to the deeper force in life.
Please correct me if I'm misunderstanding it. That sounds close to like they're misaligned and it's something they're doing, which I don't want to bridge that to like they deserve it.
No,
but like tell me where I'm missing or am I missing?
Yeah. So my point is that when someone does something horrible, I mean, my case was horrible. I killed a bird, right? But there's even much more horrible, harming a person, killing a bird, the horrible things people can do. Perpetrators are misaligned with spirit. They are cut off from their spiritual awareness. They do not feel the alignment. So the person walking down the street has done nothing wrong, but the perpetrator is someone who's stepping out. So it's a very important point because survivors of trauma will say, was this meant to be? And
okay. So your perpetrator makes sense to me. Victim doesn't.
Right. Because the perpetrator is acting in a force that is not loving. That is not a loving force. It is never the case that someone truly aligned with love is inflicting great pain on another person. That's just not the case. So there's nothing relative about it. It applies an absolute source in through all life. It implies an absolute source of love and goodness and guidance. And when we walk in tandem with that force, it is procreative, and we are cut off, as I was when I was going 55, and people have certainly done far worse than drive 55. That is out of step with the force. And I think when you look at people who've done really bad things, they don't feel that they were driven by love. And it doesn't sound like they were driven by love. I think they're out of sync.
It's fascinating. It keeps bringing me back to John's question, like, how do you know, right? But we've teased that apart a little bit already. So I'll ask a different question instead.
Well,
how do you
in the pudding, right? What has a good long-term effect and what has a terrible? When I follow a thread of love and guidance, it defies probability the good places I end up. When I don't listen to that guidance, it's to my own detriment or those people around me every time.
So that, again, is a good bridge to, I think, a little bit of the how-to, because you brought up intuition earlier. I don't know if you're familiar with like some of the stuff from Richard Wiseman and, lucky people trust their intuition.
I think you should do a best hits synthesis of your shows, splice everybody a few key moments.
We haven't had Richard on. I'd love to. It's fascinating stuff. But I think like the reason I'm bringing it up is the common messaging seems to be that there's some sort of, whatever you want to call it, right? Guiding force, gentle hands, intuition, right? Some sort of additional sense that we don't fully understand. I think my question probably comes with a really complicated answer, but it's a simple question. How do we become more in tune with that?
Beautiful. May we try another practice?
We can. We've got, let's just pause.
This is going to be a unique podcast episode, and that we have live psychotherapy on air.
Yeah.
I mean, is to clarify, this is spiritual. It's spiritual. Your branch of spiritual psychotherapy. Is that correct?
It's spiritual awareness.
Psychotherapy. We should clarify that.
Or actually, I've come for a long time. I called it spiritual awareness psychotherapy. I've now on the Columbia and Barnard campus, we call it awakened awareness, because so many young people in Barnard and undergraduates are so hungry to awaken their natural spiritual brain that we call it Awakened Awareness Group. And they They flock. They love it. This is a practice that I always thank my teacher. And when I hand a practice forward, this was a gift from the late Dr. Gary Weaver, who worked with people who felt pretty cut off from the force in and through life. And many of those people had suffered spiritual injury when in their path they met torchbearers of a religious faith that didn't walk the walk. So the fire was bright, the torch was bright, but the torchbearer, whether it was a parent, a grandparent, or perhaps a teacher or a clergy person, didn't walk the walk. So it was not by any means the failure of the faith tradition, the failure of God, the failure of spirit. It was a human foibled person who set them down the wrong path. So Dr. Gary Weaver helped people recover a direct connection to spirit, to the flame, to hold the torch themselves. And this is the practice. I'm going to invite you to close your eyes, take 5 breaths, clear out your inner space. I invite you to set before you a table in your inner chamber, a table. And to your table, you may invite anyone, living or deceased, who truly has your best interest in mind. Anyone living or deceased who truly has your best interest in mind. And with them all sitting there, ask them if they love you. And now you may invite your higher self, the part of you that is so much more than anything that you've done or not done, anything you have or don't have, your true, eternal higher self. And ask you if you love you. And now finally, you may invite your higher power, however you know your word, your higher power, and ask them if they love you. And now with all of those people sitting here right now, what do they need to tell you now? What do they need to share right now? When you're ready, I invite you back. This is your counsel, and they are always there for you. You can ask them what's on your heart at any point in your journey, and who shows up may change depending on where you are. This is your birthright. This is your natural inborn capacity to be in a transcendent relationship.
Have you tested any of these interventions? Like, what would you be hoping to see as an outcome from an experience like what you just walked us through?
That we move from a notion of being separate and isolated and splintered to being an open system where our knowing and our connection and our guidance through being an open system comes from the universe, including those who truly have our best interest in mind, our higher power, and who we really are is that deeper, eternal being that is in relationship to one another. My higher self in relationship to your higher self, not
relational spirituality.
Relational spirituality.
Yeah. We didn't get into it too much, and that's okay. I think you still touched on it. So much of this seems to happen through belonging and connection and relationships. And, if we had another 90 minutes, I'd want to tease out, like, the extent to which they confound each other. You can kind of isolate and separate them.
Have you back next year? I'll come again.
Yeah, absolutely. Be happy to.
Yeah, we have enough questions to speak to you for another 3 episodes here. So
yeah.
It's only on, just 2 of your books. So
John, you want to deliver the flourishing question?
So what's the one lesson on flourishing you want our listeners to walk away with, and what might be the practical step for putting that into action?
So I think the core point is that we are built to be in deep relationship with life. We are not an atom or a billiard ball jumping into others randomly, but we are emanations of one source, like rays from the sun. And when we know ourselves as showing up for one another as rays from the sun, then that thing that you want to say so bad, you just don't know why and where it came from, say it, because your brother or sister needs to hear it. And when they say it to you, that wasn't just a random firing. That was a gift from God herself.
Thank you.
How do you know? That's the next follow-up question. That's what I feel like
exactly,
I have that question to every question. Yeah.
Well, it's important because I've now had, thousands of moments in my life. And when I pay attention, it bears fruit and opens doors that I don't even know bright yellow doors exist yet. The problem with only sticking to what we think we want in life is that it's nothing but outdated historical data that tells us what we think we want in life. What I think I want is informed by, what I saw yesterday and what I saw when I was a kid. But what life actually brings is full of information that I have yet to perceive. And what we take is that hit, the synchronicity, the tug at the intuition, the mystical experience, the meeting a brother or sister on the road. That opens the door. That's the trail angel pointing the way to information that is infinitely greater than what I have in my back pocket from yesterday. So that hit, that high pixel hit, its meaning may unfold in time, but that is the opportunity of our lifetime to, yes, go right. Yes, go left. Listen. Because we don't know where that yellow door is going to lead. But it's great.
Cool.
It's really great.
Great. Awesome stuff. Dr. Lisa Miller, this has been a real pleasure. We're greatly appreciative of the time. Tell people where they can get in touch with you. Where can they find out more about your work?
Oh, thank you. So Instagram, dr.lisa Miller. I have a website, Lisa Miller PhD, and I invite anyone to join us at the Spirituality Mind Body Institute at Columbia. We host open events.
Awesome. Cool. Well, like I said, we greatly appreciate the time and dropping some knowledge on us, and hope we'll be able to chat again.
Well, thanks for deeply engaging. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, Lisa. Huge thanks to all of you for listening to today's show.
If you like what you heard, please share it with friends, family, colleagues, and be sure to leave us a 5-star review. You can also find us on all social media platforms. We've got our own YouTube channel, and you can check out our website at flourishfmpodcast.com.
We'd also love to hear from you. There's a survey in the show notes you can complete where you can complete any suggestions on guests you'd like to hear us interview or particular topics or themes you'd like to hear us talk about. We'd love to hear your feedback on that, so your feedback would be greatly appreciated if you could fill out that form. Until next time, thank you very much for joining us today.
And keep putting in the work.